One, two, three, four.
Welcome to the High Performance CEO Show, your exclusive insight into the strategies and success habits of the world's top CEOs. I'm your host, Sebastian Schieke, entrepreneur, mentor, and business angel. Prepare to grow your business, enhance your leadership skills, and thrive in today's world. Let's dive in. Welcome to another episode of the High Performance CEO Show. Today I have a very special guest, and we look at the world from a more global view and looking at all these challenges we're currently facing. Today I'm speaking with Thomas P.M. Barnett, and he's a leading geopolitical strategist and a best-selling author of the Pentagon's New Map, who has presented his worldview on and strategic planning concepts as master classes to senior corporate leadership cohorts across the financial, energy, agriculture, defense, and non-profit sectors. To name a few, he worked for Mars, Royal Dutch Shell, Sinopec, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. Thomas is currently releasing his latest book, America's New Map, Restoring Our Global Leadership in an Era of Climate Change and Demographic Collapse. We will talk about this book in detail today. It's a very fascinating book. I had the pleasure to read it before it is released. And in this book, Thomas starts a new strategic dialogue on how, especially America, can re-emerge as a global leader as we navigate the three major shifts of globalization: climate change, demographics, and middle-class consumption. Thomas holds a PhD in political science from the Harvard University. And over his career, Thomas has authored more than 500 publications, delivered more than 1,000 speeches across all 50 US states and over 50 countries, including his TED Talk, Let's Rethink America's Military Strategy. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Sebastian.
You gave me a lot to read. I was basically eating your book. It was so fascinating. And you look at the world in a very geopolitical strategic view. And you're putting a couple of theses in this book, which are very challenging for many people. First of all, you talk about the challenges we face, and you offer possible solution to those challenges. Maybe before we really dive into this book, what drove you to write such a tremendous book?
Well, a big part was the offer from the company I work at now. This was part of their recruitment of me. Throughline Incorporated, we're an enterprise design firm. And they were interested in creating a book on geopolitics that would be accessible to a wide audience, that would have advanced data visualizations and illustrations. So kind of an illustrated geopolitical primer of the world today. And they were interested in kind of putting that out there because they were concerned, as was I, and this was my primary motivation, that there were a lot of books out there talking about how America was going to hell in a handbasket domestically, everything falling apart.
Yeah.
Then there's this entire genre of books saying that the world is falling apart. But there wasn't anything that kind of bridged those two realities. And it's a key argument of America's New Map that what's going on inside the United States is really a microcosm in many ways of what's going on in the wider world.
Yeah.
So, for example, you get that sense of whites in America feeling like they're being displaced or replaced or overwhelmed by non-white cultures as America's racial makeup evolves fairly dramatically, and as it has been for the last 6-7 decades, and will even more so the next 3 or 4 decades. But that's kind of a microcosm of how America looks at a world where kind of non-European elements are coming to dominate global markets, global finances, all these different things that for a long time have been so clearly identified with the United States, so that we looked at the world and saw globalization as largely kind of our creation, a reflection of our values. And now it's not necessarily that. It's kind of evolving into something different, and we're not sensing ourselves at the center of gravity or the eye of the storm anymore. And that's kind of disorienting, much as it is for a white population in America that's seeing its culture dramatically shift and change as we become a much more multicultural and much more balanced racial mix.
This affects, of course, how people think and how people see what's happening in the world, affects politics. And in your initial chapter of your book, I really liked one statement, and I just want to mention this here. Too many of us choose to resist the future and escape the present by retreating into the past. This hardly makes us unique. Many economic powers facing decline reject invention, instead embracing the fantasy of recapturing lost greatness by scapegoating evil internal forces deemed responsible for this treasonous outcome. And if democracy is hollowed out by this wish consciousness, that's just tease up the authoritarian reboot. Make America great again. Yeah, this is what we...
Right. It's this sense of, in American history, whenever the middle class feels threatened, we become an entirely intolerant society and very negative in our views of the world and very unwilling to engage the world. We become isolationist and very me-focused. And so that's a period that we've gone through time and time again. And it's important for us to understand that there are profound consequences, for economic growth. If you want a moral society, if you want a giving and open society, you need to have that middle class in strong stead as much as possible, because that's how democracy functions. It functions off the middle, where the middle rules itself. I mean, think back to where the Western middle class arose at the beginning of the 20th century. You got fascism from the right, you got Bolshevism from the left, both seeking to control or prevent the rise of the so-called bourgeoisie and what that would mean. America was very fortunate to have the Roosevelts, Theodore and Franklin, the progressive era that we went through that really regraded our economic landscape and made us a middle-class centric democracy. And that's what's being threatened now by our relationship with globalization and all the strong economic competitive pressures that we're seeing. But at the same time, we're sort of rerunning that experiment that Europe and the United States ran at the beginning of the 20th century when their middle class developed. We're doing that all over again on a global scale now. Think about a global middle class that was only about 2 billion souls at the beginning of the century. Now it's more like 4 billion. It's going to be more like 6 or 7 billion by mid-century. And that rise of a global middle class, which I think is the greatest accomplishment America has ever achieved, because we set in motion that rule set of globalization that allowed that kind of connectivity and that democratization of trade and investment flows to unfold, so that we're talking about, for the first time in history, a global majority middle class, which for as long as I can remember, going all the way back to my childhood, was considered an impossibility. It was going to be haves versus have-nots, and it was only going to get worse. That's a positive development. I think America has much pride to take in that unfolding of globalization and the democratization of wealth creation around the planet the last 4 or 5 decades. Absolutely amazing. And yet it puts us in this position where democracy is really on a very difficult path, because we're seeing all sorts of, just like we did in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, authoritarian single-party rule offerings from the left, that's sort of China, and then the strongman nationalist autocrat offering from the right. That's your Putin, that's your Orban, that's Trump in America. And we could really see prospects for democracy come under very great stress over the next 2 to 3 decades, in large part because, that global middle class is increasingly centered in the global South. That's where the growth is going to be. And it just so happens that's where climate change is going to have its strongest impact, which is why those are 2 of the big themes of the book. Dealing with this emergent and voluminous global middle class demand for a better life, and dealing with the fact that that part of the world is coming under such great environmental stress for the next 4 to 5 decades, guaranteed. No matter how well we do on climate change, the next half century is going to be very hard.
Yeah, you put some shocking numbers in this book, which we will touch on. So you structured your book in 7 through lines. So the first through line you mentioned already is globalization. Yeah?
Right.
It's
the rise of a global
the rise
middle class.
of a global middle class, the rise of global trade, exchange of goods, which is now under threat because, as you wrote in your book, it's used in a political way to
Demonize outside forces.
exactly, yeah. And but you also mentioned that the creators of globalization withdraw from this concept. Yeah, I mean it's all doom and so you really also stress the fact that globalization is not only physical goods anymore. When we all live in a digital connected world, so there's so much exchange. We will touch on globalization a bit more in detail after we went through the 7 true-line points. So the next one is the accelerating climate change. This is your true-line point number 2.
Right. It really takes the world that has been east-west in its orientation and turns it into a north-south orientation.
Yes.
And that alone is one of the biggest changes any of us will ever live through.
Very interesting concept. I mean, you wrote climate change now remaps the planet, tragically rendering much of Middle Earth. And Middle Earth is your definition of
lower latitudes.
Lower latitudes extending 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So all the countries
where half the world's population lives, and most of the future middle-class growth that we project is going to happen there too.
Yeah. So we will talk about what impact this have on half of the world's population, that climate change is basically affecting their existence there. This leads into the third true line, the global demographic transition. What do you mean with that?
Well, that's the reality that as you modernize, you go from a high birth, high death rate to a low birth, low death rate.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, there's usually a lag between increases in health, especially early childhood health and maternal health and prenatal care. There's a gap between a lag between society achieving those benefits and then starting to realize they don't need to procreate at the old rural rate, which is much higher as they urbanize and modernize and industrialize. And what that usually creates is this large generational pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a baby boom is the term we used in the United States
Yes.
after the Second World War. As that ages, it becomes a youth bulge. As that ages further, it becomes what they call a demographic dividend, a tremendous concentration of labor in a society with few elders and few children. But ultimately, that becomes kind of a rapid aging of the society, sometimes called an elder tsunami. So it's almost like this pig moving through the python, this singular generation that's inordinately large when you experience that demographic transition. And that creates this amazing opportunity for society to kind of connect up to the global economy and on that basis offer its cheap labor as a means of attracting foreign direct investment and the creation of global value chains. If you think about that, the United States came out of the Second World War with a demographic dividend, kind of ruled the global economy for 20 years. Then Japan arose with its own population boom post-war.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought they were going to rule the global economy forever. But then the Chinese appeared with a demographic dividend of about 300 million workers. That came and went across the 90s and 2000s. Now we're really looking at Southeast Asia with a demographic dividend, kind of an excess labor pool of about 400 million, to be followed by the Indians with one that's going to be about 500 million. It's starting to come online right now. And after that, Africa, the Middle East. So if you think about that kind of follow the demographic dividend reality across the map, it goes from America to Japan, to China, to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, ultimately Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. That's sort of the demographic center of gravity within globalization. And you can track where all the manufacturing goes to take advantage of that wage differential. And it also kind of gives you a sense of why China's doing Belt and Road investments following that wave because it's really not just about accessing resources for the Chinese. It's about accessing that cheap labor. As they move up the production chain, they have to invest in follow-on countries who are, like they did once, experiencing now a demographic dividend that allows them to be accessed and integrated and pulled into the global production chains. And then on that basis, you sell goods to these people because you're going to see an exploding middle class as part of that process. So I always say, follow the demographic dividend as it moves across the map.
Mhm.
You're really looking at globalization's center of gravity.
Well, True Line 4 basically takes this concept even further. Can you say a few words about the next
Through line
point?
4 is kind of the collision
Mhm.
of that global middle class and climate change happening at the same time.
Yeah.
In this, with the effects largely concentrated in one part of the world, that Middle Earth I call 30 degrees in north and south of the equator. And it really speaks to kind of a north-south integrating imperative that's being forced on us, because you're going to see, like we're seeing with plants and animals, humans are starting to migrate towards the poles.
Yes.
In response to temperature changes. We're seeing this with species, animals, plants, viruses. Everything's kind of moving towards the pole because, or mostly towards the north, because that's where more land is relative to the south.
Mhm.
And you're going to see that with climate refugees more and more. I would argue a lot of the flow that we're experiencing in the United States towards our southern border already reflects
Climate
climate
change.
refugees.
Yeah.
We're not calling them that. But if you're driven off the land and then driven into the city because you can't farm anymore, because there's drought, because there are hurricanes that destroy your crops and your infrastructure on a regular basis, you may be leaving the capital city because of gang activity, but ultimately what started that journey for you was climate change.
Yeah.
And I would argue a lot of what's going into Europe in terms of migrant flows right now also reflect
Definitely.
climate change.
Yeah.
So if you have that kind of reality, the fourth through line is all about this north-south integrating reality, which can be looked at as a negative thing, kind of a burden, north versus south, or you can look at it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. This is the opportunity for north-south integration, for the expansion of unions. I could argue the United States should look at Latin America as a source of potential future states as we grow our union, and on that basis offer kind of economic and political status and protection to states that are otherwise going to be called into question by climate change's increasing impact across that part of the world. We're talking predictions, strong predictions based on real science, that Middle Earth by mid-century is going to be experiencing a climate reality that's akin to what you experience in the Saharan desert today, meaning average daily temperatures around 90 degrees, close to 90 degrees, and very minimal rainfall, which doesn't turn it into the Saharan desert across that vast swath overnight, but it does historically represent a climate niche that most humans flee from. It's too hard. It's too hard to live there. Just like there are not strong states in the Saharan desert, there are underpopulated areas, ungovernable spaces. I'm talking about a Middle Earth encompassing half the world's humanity. It's going to endure that sort of stress for the next 4 to 5 decades. And on that basis, I think there are strong incentives for northern superpowers to create structures that allow the socialization of that risk south to north. And on that basis, keep as many people in that Middle Earth band as possible in the most resilient way possible, while accommodating a certain flow of northward refugees. Because if you're not doing kind of that first part, the second part's going to get out of control.
Yeah, you will end up with areas with lots of problems, civil wars, and terrorism.
Kind of Mad Max dystopia that we love to entertain.
You talk about Superpower Brand War. So basically, superpowers competing with each other, building brands like in the business world, attracting talents, attracting people migrating to this country or joining the country as additional states. And This all leads into your through line 5, yeah, which
It's
is
an acknowledgement.
yeah,
Through line 5 is an acknowledgement that the regionalization dynamic that we're witnessing today is both natural and kind of inevitable. If for a long time, what we defined as globalization was kind of sending money and resources to Asia to take advantage of its incredible wage differential, so that distance seemed non-existent. As long as you timed everything in terms of all those giant container ships,
yeah,
it was almost zero cost to send stuff to Asia and have it assembled and manufactured there because the labor differential was so strong. And that became our definition of globalization, this kind of maximalized cross-hemispheric trade. Well, that worked. China rose, Asia has risen, India is following soon after, and now Asia in general is starting to consume most of what it manufactures. It's becoming its own integrated demand and manufacturing hub, much like the EU already is, and much like America has been for quite some time. Okay, so that kind of slows down after the Great Recession kicks in. It kind of flatlines the trade in physical goods. And it flatlines a certain amount of cross-border foreign direct investment because we're not taking advantage of that situation in Asia because it's kind of matured and now it's its own reality, a third giant hub in addition to the EU and the United States. And that has triggered us to reconsider the supply chain risks associated with going all the way to the other side of the world to get stuff and have it manufactured and brought all the way back. I mean, the pandemic probably did that more than anything else. And it's starting to push a sort of re-rationalization of supply chains that says, hey, if the wage differential isn't there in Asia, then why not look closer to where the wage differential does still exist? For America, that could be Latin America. For Europe, that could be Africa and the Middle East. You could look at Southeast Asia and East Asia and say that kind of regionalization now makes sense. Now, that gets interpreted as a deglobalization, which I think is a misnomer. It's the natural next stage evolution of a global economy that has successfully integrated Asia, where Asia is its own power.
yeah,
And it makes now much more sense for those big three northern hubs to start integrating southward because that's where the global middle class is. That's where the demographics are still strong, much more fertile. Whereas across the north, we're seeing depopulation dynamics kick in. That's where the global middle south is. And that's where that global middle south is going to come under the threat of climate change. So you have good and bad reasons now to start focusing on your vertical slice of the world, north to south, not just east to west, which is how we've looked at the world for decades and centuries, but north-south. So, and as that's all happening, we talk about the digitalization of globalization, because even as physical trade of goods, physical goods flatlines starting in 2008, digital trade in goods skyrockets. I mean, something like 40 to 50-fold in a 15-year period, to the point where McKinsey Global Institute now estimates that more than half of global trade is digital content. So if you look at it like that and you see this north-south world coming apart, coming together, or risking coming apart over climate change, and you see the Chinese coming in with their 5G networks and their Hikvision cameras and their Huawei 5G phones, and see the way that they're spreading all this network connectivity to the global south, and with it, a certain amount of surveillance technology.
Yes.
Social control technology, which is booming, for example, across Latin America. Then you start to see not just the promise of this north-south, but you're starting to see some of the peril, or at least you're starting to recognize that whether or not the EU and the United States is aware of this, China is very aggressively moving in network-wise to become the dominant player north-south in this next evolution of globalization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's certainly not necessarily a good thing either, but it's a competitive thing.
Yeah.
And if the EU values its ethos and its rules and its way of doing business, and the United States does the same, we got to play on this playing field a lot more aggressively. Otherwise, we're going to see vast parts of the world kind of drawn into China's definition of what a good life in globalization entails and what's feasible in terms of political pluralism, which they don't adhere to as a concept.
I really like your statement of these super brands, and you had one line here in this book. In the century, superpowers will prevail not according to the millions they field as level soldiers, but the billions they attract as loyal subscribers. Yeah, so
right.
They being as like in the business world as brand, an employer brand in this way, a brand for other nations, which attracting those nations to integrate them in their community. Yeah, like the EU is doing, like America did a long time ago.
It's sort of a paradox that we're in this period where, after a lot of embracing of globalization, you've seen sort of a nationalist backlash across a lot of countries. But when you get below that nation state level to the level of individuals, what you're really seeing is the creation of multiple world spanning identities, subscriptions, a sense of brand loyalties, people living online more and more, identities becoming very fractured, very fungible. And I would argue a person's sense of patriotism and citizenship now is open to redefinition when you could become part of global communities or part of global brand cohorts, and you're experiencing life on a much more profound level through all these different media. Patriotism, your sense of citizenship is just one identity. There's a whole bunch of more identities out there that can be explored. That can come off as kind of gobbledygook, let's say, to older generations. But if you have kids, I have 6 kids, 2 of them are millennials, 4 of them are Gen Zs. I would tell you that their sense of citizenship is like one of 10 or 12 strong core identities that they have.
Yes. Yeah.
And it competes for attention with everything else they do in their life. And that's why you're seeing numbers like a sense of patriotism in the average American come down fairly dramatically in the last couple decades. And part of it's because, the United States hasn't performed particularly well in the last couple decades. But part of it is there's a lot more competition for people's allegiance out there. And that's why I think it's crucial that we understand our brand attraction, which I think is very strong. I think the EU's is very strong as well, because we are 2 regions of the world where people want to come. And I use this analogy in this through line of sort of like free agency in modern sports. You get to the end of the season, and if your contract's up, you can go sign with another team.
Exactly. I would love this.
Right. So if you did this on a global scale, I would tell you a lot of states or a lot of individuals would they'd sign with the EU. They'd sign with the United States. Would they sign with China?
Or Russia?
Probably not. Or Russia. Well, they're losing subscribers, I would say, rather dramatically if you check out their border flows as of late. India, maybe, depending on where you live. A pretty decent brand. And I think you really have to look at it like that it's not just how companies that make products are trying to attract brand loyalty with this emerging global middle class, which, if you think about it, for almost eternity has been attracted to or utilized unbranded, unpackaged, unprocessed goods. And now they're moving into all these brand possibilities. And we know historically that when you get somebody young in terms of their brand, whether it's political or the car they buy or their favorite cereal, you can lock them into a lifetime subscription.
Exactly.
Or,
fan.
And I'd say we're really looking at a period in history with this global middle class. It's not just, do they like Coke versus Pepsi? It's, do they like the United States versus China? We got to realize we're in that kind of struggle. We tend to view the world through military, engagements. And so right now, we think the world is defined by Ukraine versus Russia and the potentiality for China versus Taiwan. While those are
Or
really
China
important,
versus America in the end.
exactly,
Yeah.
those are important things to deal with, no doubt.
Yeah.
But these are not the conflicts that are going to define which superpowers prevail in the next 20, 30, 40 years. These are vestiges from the Cold War.
Yeah.
These are leftovers. I mean, we're still fighting over the kids in the great divorce that was the Soviet Union coming apart. Most of the kids don't want to live with dad. They want to go live with mom in Europe.
30 years ago.
And every chance they
I
get, they
experienced this
leave.
growing up in East Germany and the
Right.
socialist part. Yeah.
Right.
So you put this all into different through lines, and in through line 7, you offer, basically a possible solution how the world could deal with the challenges. Probably a painful solution, looking at this right now, because we all want to, most of humanity, people resist change, they want to keep it as it is. But you say that change is inevitable. Change is required to survive as a species, as a planet. And so your solution is the North-South integration, a possible solution.
Right. And I make the case rather strongly in the last through line that, there is a logic for America first.
Yeah.
If you say Americas first, if you start to think about the Western Hemisphere as a civilization and a culture all its own that is ripe for integration. For example, if you look at trade integration in the EU, it's about 70%.
Mm-hmm.
You look at East Asia, it's about 50%. You look at North America, it's only 40%. And that's after 3 decades of NAFTA.
Well,
you look at Latin America, the trade integration's in the teens.
Mm-hmm.
It's very low. And the trade integration North and South America remains very low. I would argue that logic has to yield, in part because of the demographic challenges. It's an aging North, a still younger South, and because of the climate change reality that's going to stress out Middle Earth and send a lot of people northward unless the North integrates southward and socializes that underlying and profound and growing risk posed by climate change. So that if you look at the world in 3 slices, the Western Hemisphere, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, I'm saying the West Hemispheric route towards integration is easier than the other 2.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have fewer languages.
Yeah.
We have a greater concentration of religion along Christianity. It's not Christian versus Muslim.
No more compatible culture.
Complexity, right, of East Asia, which is immensely complex. And if you look at the Western Hemisphere as a whole, we're very self-sufficient on energy, incredibly blessed in terms of water.
Yeah.
We have about 3 times as much of the world's supply relative to our population share. And we are the major excess producer for inter-regional flows of food.
Mm-hmm.
The middle slice kind of basically feeds itself or has to import to a certain extent. Asia creates a tremendous amount of food, but it's 60% of the world's population. They can't feed themselves. And it's going to be even harder with climate change. In the Western Hemisphere, we're the source for about 4/5 of the excess grain that can be exported across the planet to meet growing food needs. So if you look at all those things coming together, the simplicity, the coherence, in effect, the lack of diversity in the Western Hemisphere, or the reality, as I like to say, that the Western Hemisphere is pre-mixed by globalization. Because if you think about it, Amerindians existing there, the indigenous populations, Europeans come, Africans are brought in the slave trade, Asians migrate in numbers. We got the 4 major racial groups, let's say, of the world pre-mixing in the Western Hemisphere for the last 400 or 500 years, thanks largely to European colonialism. So I could argue that we're furthest along in this sort of blending of religions and identities and cultures. We have all sorts of resource advantages. We're a fairly benign system in the Western Hemisphere. We haven't had wars. for decades or centuries, to be honest. There hasn't been many border changes. And frankly, we're unusually democratic as a group relative to the other parts of the world. So that if you want to make a reshoring, homeshoring, America first sort of argument, I say make it an America's first, not just North America,
The whole
but Central America,
yeah.
South America, the Caribbean, the Arctic North. That is a natural integration target that I think America would do well to pursue. And by its example, and through the extension or the replication of what Europe's been doing,
Be a role
going
model.
east for the last 20, 30, 40 years, very successfully and growing. A process that I would like to see turn south over time, kind of bring in the Mediterranean, because I think either you bring them in or it becomes an increasing problem for you over time. Those become kind of the dominant examples within the world system of how superpowers deal with the world as we find it today. All these fragmenting impulses amidst a certain re-regionalization and the shifting of the world from east-west to north-south because of climate change. I think that's the real nature of superpower competition going forward. And I think America needs to embrace it and to start embodying that sort of logic in the same way that the Europeans have with their accession process, which I think is the best display of soft power I've seen in the last 30, 40 years.
But how can it be that at least from our perception outside of the US, that the population is so much focused on, or is so strong in the opinion that they have to make America great again, they have to incorporate everything, they have to pull back production, that they have to build this wall.
It's nostalgia, and it's because we're still ruled by boomers. We're living under a gerontocracy now. A lot of our leaders are in their 70s.
Yeah.
And we got two guys who are running for president who, both being north of 80 when the vote comes. And you saw that happen throughout Europe and some of the countries that are experiencing the strongest, most rapid demographic changes. Italy was putting up these really old guys as leaders. Japan's another classic example. You get these really old individuals. And, the attraction of nostalgia for the boomers is strong because, that 1950s, that 1960s, thanks to a demographic dividend, thanks to the destruction of the Second World War, we dominated half of global GDP. So, of course, it was easy to succeed and have a good life in that world. And so they want to go back to it because it's simpler and it's what they remember, and everybody idealizes their childhood.
Yeah.
But it's a complete fantasy. We couldn't stay there. We were never going to stay there. And we sure as hell can't go back now, because the only way forward is through a number of realities that force us to adapt and change. And if you're really interested in America being powerful, you better be interested in a very multicultural America, country full of quote unquote woke companies that are interested in aggressively marketing to emerging consumer groups that are going to be overwhelmingly non-white, overwhelmingly non-American, overwhelmingly non-Western. And if you're not about that, then you're about an America that's going to shrink and get small and be less powerful and age rapidly and basically go the route of Japan, which is not a route I want to go. And basically the route I think the Brits have chosen by breaking off from the EU. I think they're going to regret it, and they're going to end up having to connect with somebody. I mean, I think they're fantasizing about some sort of magical India, UK connection because of past colonial ties. I think, honestly, they'd be better off coming to America as 3 or 4 states because we love British accents, and they could probably run the White House for the next 50, 60 years with no problem.
That's interesting theory.
I really do. There's nothing about this future that says you don't want to get bigger. You don't want to be more networked. You don't want to have more capacity, more adherents, more subscribers, more customers, more citizens, more patriots, whatever you want to call it, coming to your brand, because that's going to give you the bulk, especially when it's north-south bulk, to get through this next 3 to 4 or 5 decades of tremendous environmental stress. I am very optimistic long-term about climate change. I'm not a existential threat kind of guy. I think there are lots of things that we're doing now that are going to really get this under control by 2100, where it's reasonable to speak about kind of weathering the storm.
Yeah.
But that storm is here. That storm is baked into our system for the next 3 to 4 decades. It's going to happen with all this tremendous demographic transition going on, all this global middle class demands for a better life that are going to be met, or you're going to see political instability on a great scale, all this migratory pressure, as you got an aging north and a still fertile south, all that stuff's got to be adjusted and dealt with. I think if you're not evolving as a superpower between now and say 2080, there's a really good chance you won't be a superpower come 2080. And that's my concern for the United States. It's my concern for Europe. I'm less concerned for the other three because they're not as democratic as we are, even as I really think India's path is going to be extremely influential. I'm more worried about the West waking up to these realities. And on that basis, modeling the behavior of what success is. You think about what we did in the Cold War, not that many countries. We're about 1/5 of the world's population. And we were so successful in our mini globalization, so-called free world, that we attracted the emulation of the East, and the Soviet Empire disappeared without a shot being fired on the power of that example.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like we need to make a similar effort with the United States and the EU offering the best pathways forward, because we have the best brand recognition and loyalty, and because we've been built for a long time for that kind of expansion. We started as 13 colonies. Yeah,
we have to set up, to attract.
We have to set up. Yeah. You guys modeled a similar setup, very cleverly executed, brilliant soft power promulgation. And, I think the two of us need to look at it and say, we have some real skill advantages here. We have some brand advantages. And what we should do, and if we really want to strike fear in the hearts of our competitors, if Taiwan had decided to join China on its own, there'd be no fuss. If they really wanted to do it, we'd say, fine. How could we stop it? Belarus joined Russia. Nobody batted an eye. If Ukraine really wanted to join Russia and did in a union like Belarus did, nobody would care. No. There'd be some concern about food security and whatnot, but there'd be no problem. It's their forcible threat that scares us.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is, if you have such an attractive brand, your ability to bring in new members, to attract new members, that's scary. It's so scary in Russia, it started a war out of the fear that the attractiveness of the EU and NATO
is so strong
meant they were going to lose Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because they have such a terrible brand, they can't even keep this, historical, very profound part of Russian culture, quite frankly, is the Ukrainian civilization. And they couldn't keep it because their package is so bad that Ukraine said, we'd prefer to go west. And that soft power scared Russia into that war, which tells me that the EU's attraction is a hell of a lot more powerful
than having a lot of
the Russian
weapons.
Military is going to be.
Yeah.
That's
an interesting aspect.
That's a big hint about where things are going.
I find shocking really the change we put on the planet. When that we changed 97% of
environment.
Yeah. Those are shocking numbers.
Historically, our religions, our political ideologies were all based on this notion of taming nature and bending it to our will and making it what we wanted of it, and to remake the world in our image.
Thank you for tuning into the High Performance CEO Show. I'm your host, Sebastian Schieke, and it's been a pleasure serving you. Please subscribe to our show on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create a bigger impact. Check out our website, sebastianschieke.com, for additional resources. Until next time, Be bold, be exceptional, be outstanding, be a leader.